The word hit Ida Collins like a slap across the face, sharp and sudden, and leaving a sting that spread through her whole chest before she even fully understood what Patrick Langston had just said. "Nothing," he repeated, and the way he said it was almost gentle, which made it worse. "The land is worth nothing, Ida. The soil is played out, the water table is dropping, and any honest surveyor will tell you the same thing I'm telling you right now." She stood in the doorway of the ranch house that had belonged to her father, a house she had ridden 200 miles to reach, and she felt the floor shift beneath her boots like the earth itself was agreeing with him. The evening light came through the window and fell across the deed she was holding, the paper her father had sent her before he died, with his shaking hand and his proud signature at the bottom. Patrick stood with his hat in one hand and something in his eyes that looked almost like regret. But there was a hidden motive behind it too, something closed off and deliberate. And Ida had grown up around enough men who wore their calculations behind soft expressions to recognize it when she saw it. "My father believed in this land," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "Your father was a good man with a dreamer's heart," Patrick said, "and I respected him. But respecting a man doesn't mean lying to his daughter about what he left behind." She looked at him for a long time. The deed felt warm in her hand, or maybe that was just her own blood running hot with something she couldn't yet name, whether it was grief or fury, or the very particular sensation of knowing that someone was trying to take something from you by convincing you it wasn't worth taking. "Who owns the land next to mine?" she asked. The question seemed to surprise him. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and gone. "A mining consortium out of Denver," he said. "But that's irrelevant. They've been working their claim for 2 years and found nothing worth reporting." "And the claim south of mine, also theirs." Ida looked down at the deed. Then she looked back up at Patrick Langston, at his jaw and his broad shoulders and the careful stillness of a man who had rehearsed this conversation. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Langston," she said. She closed the door on him. And then she stood in her father's house in the dark that was settling around her like a second skin, and she breathed and she thought, and she did not cry. Not yet. To understand why that moment cracked something open inside her that she hadn't known needed cracking, you have to go back 3 weeks. To the morning, a telegram arrived at the schoolhouse in Abilene, where Ida Collins had been teaching the children of cattle drovers and railroad workers for 4 years. She had been 26 years old, which in 1882 was old enough to know better about most things and still young enough to be surprised by the worst of them. The telegram was from a man named Hector Briggs, who identified himself as the county land clerk for Coppervale County in the Colorado Territory, and it said that her father, Edmund Collins, had died of a heart ailment 2 weeks prior, and that he had left her the deed to a 400-acre ranch outside a town called Reed Rock, and that she had 60 days to register the transfer of ownership or the land would revert to territorial possession. Ida had read it twice. Then she had folded it carefully, put it in her coat pocket, finished the lesson she had been giving on long division, dismissed the children at the proper hour, gone home to the 2 rooms she rented above the feed store, and sat down at her kitchen table and cried for an hour. She had not seen her father in 3 years. Not since the winter he had packed everything he owned into a wagon and gone west, following the kind of hope that men his age caught like a fever, the belief that there was something better waiting just past the next ridge, just over the next line of mountains. He had written her faithfully, every month, letters that arrived smelling of dust, and sometimes faintly of tobacco, describing the land in language that was almost poetry, telling her about the way the light hit the red rock formations at sunset, about the creek that ran cold and clear along the east border of his claim, about the way the silence at night was different from any silence he had ever known. He had never asked her to come. She had known he was protecting her, keeping her in the life that had a salary and a roof and certainty, because Edmund Collins had spent most of his life navigating between the life he dreamed of and the life that was actually possible, and he had wanted something cleaner than that for his daughter. But now he was gone, and he had left her the land, and there was a decision to make. Ida packed her things in 2 days. She gave the school board proper notice, though they were unhappy about it. She sold the furniture she wouldn't need and bought a good horse, a gray mare she named Clara, and she arranged her travel by a combination of rail and riding. And on a Tuesday morning in early October of 1882, she pointed herself west toward the Colorado Territory and did not look back. The journey took 10 days. She had traveled before, enough to know how to manage herself, how to speak plainly to men who might mistake a woman traveling alone for an easy target, how to choose safe lodging and keep her money in more than one place. She was not naive, but she was also not afraid, which some people mistook for the same thing. They were not the same thing. Fear and wisdom were different tools. When she reached Raydrock, it was late afternoon on a Thursday, and the town was small and sun-baked and alive in the way frontier towns were alive, which was to say that half of it was in motion and half of it looked like it might fall over if the wind shifted. There was a main street with a general store, a land office, a livery stable, a 2-story hotel called the Copper Crown, a saloon, a barber shop, and a Baptist church that looked newer than everything else. There were houses spreading out behind the main street in an irregular pattern, as if the town had grown by accident rather than design. There were horses everywhere and the smell of them, and the sounds of a place where people were building something and weren't yet sure whether it would last. Ida checked into the Copper Crown, paid for a room for a week, washed the travel off her face, and went to find the land office. The land clerk, Hector Briggs, turned out to be a thin, nervous-looking man in his 40s who wore reading glasses and seemed genuinely moved to see her, in the way that clerks who deal primarily in documents occasionally are when a document becomes a real person. He walked her through everything. The deed was valid and clear, her father's claim properly registered and paid up, no liens against it. The ranch itself had a small house, a barn in moderate condition, a dry goods storage shed, and the creek, which Briggs confirmed was still running. Your father was well liked, Briggs told her. He worked the land hard but had troubles with the soil, tried a few different crops, kept a small herd, had maybe 40 head of cattle when he died. He paused. Those went to pay the doctor and the burial costs. I hope that's acceptable. It's fair, Ida said. There's a neighbor, Briggs said, and his tone shifted slightly in a way she noticed. Patrick Langston runs a large operation north of your father's land. He came in about 2 weeks ago when news of your father's passing got around, asking about the claim's status. What did he want to know? Briggs adjusted his glasses. Whether there was an heir, whether the land might revert. He has land on 3 sides of your father's claim, north, east, and west. Ida absorbed this. And who owns the south side? A Denver consortium, Meridian Mining Company. They've had a placer claim on the creek south of you for about 18 months. She thanked Briggs, registered the deed transfer in her name, and rode out to see the ranch. It was 2 miles outside of town, and as she rode, the landscape opened up around her in a way that made her understand her father's letters better. The red rock formations rose on either side like sentinels, and the late afternoon light made them burn gold and amber, and the air was so dry and clean it almost hurt to breathe after a decade of Kansas dust. She could see why a man might come here and feel like he had found something true. The ranch house was small but solid, built from the local stone with a wooden roof and 2 rooms inside. The barn was indeed in moderate condition, which meant it needed work but wouldn't fall. The creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, clear and cold as Briggs had promised. She walked every acre of it before the light failed, and when she came back to the house and sat on the front step in the dark with the sound of the creek carrying to her on the evening air, she felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for a long time, some restlessness she hadn't had a name for until now. This was her father's dream, and now it was hers, and she would make it work. It was the next morning that Patrick Langston appeared. She had seen him coming from half a mile away, a big man on a dark horse, riding with the ease of someone who had spent so many years in the saddle that it had become his natural posture. He was probably 32 or 33, with dark hair and jaw that carried a day or two of stubble, and he rode up to her front gate and tipped his hat with a courtesy that she noted was genuine, not performative. "Miss Collins," he said. "Patrick Langston. I have the spread to the north. I knew your father." "I know who you are," she said, which surprised him. He dismounted and tied his horse, and she let him in and offered him coffee from the small store her father had left in the kitchen, and they sat across from each other at the rough wooden table, and he told her he was sorry for her loss, which she believed, and then he began to tell her about the land. He was thorough. She gave him that. He talked about the soil composition, the rainfall patterns, the history of what her father had tried to grow, the challenges with the water table. He talked about what the land had been when her father bought it, and what it was now, after 3 hard seasons of drought and poor yield. He talked with the authority of a man who knew this country, and much of what he said sounded credible. And then he said the land was worth nothing. And then he said he would be willing to take it off her hands, not at value, since there was no value, but as a neighborly gesture. He named a figure. It was insultingly small, and the way he named it with careful neutrality told her he knew it was small and had decided the insult was an acceptable risk. She didn't say anything for a moment. She was listening to something underneath his words, the thing that wasn't being said, the thing that was hidden. "The mining consortium to the south," she said. "Meridian Mining. What are they mining?" "Placer gold in the creek," he said without hesitation. "Small amounts, barely commercial. And have they been on my father's land?" "Not that I know of." She studied him. He was looking at her with an expression that was meant to be open and helpful, and most of it was genuine, but there was a layer beneath it that she couldn't quite read, a tension in the set of his shoulders, in the way his right hand rested a little too carefully on the table. That evening, after he left, she sat down with her father's papers. Edmund Collins had been a careful man in some ways and a dreamer in others, but he had kept records. Ida went through every document in the wooden box under his bed, reading everything by lamplight while the creek whispered outside and the desert night cooled around the stone walls. Most of it was what she expected. Letters, receipts, a few land surveys. But there was one document she almost missed, a folded piece of paper tucked inside an old surveying report, and when she unfolded it, she found herself reading a letter from a man named Amos Whitfield, who described himself as an independent assay consultant. The letter was dated 8 months ago, and it was addressed to her father. It said that based on the rock samples Edmund had sent him, there were clear indications of a significant copper and silver deposit beneath the eastern portion of the Collins claim, specifically along the creek bed and the rock shelf running parallel to it. It said the deposit appeared to be underground, not placer, which was why it hadn't been found by the creekside operations. It said that if the formation held the way the samples suggested, it could be one of the more substantial finds in the county. It said Edmund should file a mineral claim immediately and engage legal counsel. The letter was there. The samples were not, but the letter was there in her father's box, which meant her father had known. Ida sat with the letter for a long time. Outside, a coyote called, long and lonesome, and was answered from somewhere far away. The lamplight moved in a draft from the window. Her father had known what was under his land. And then he had died. And then very quickly, Patrick Langston had come to the land office asking whether there was an heir. She thought about what Briggs had said. That Langston had land on 3 sides of hers. That the mining consortium was on the south, working the creek. She thought about Patrick Langston sitting across her table with his careful neutrality and his insultingly small offer and his hidden motive. She thought about the word betrayal and let it sit in her mouth for a moment, tasting it. Then she folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket alongside the deed, blew out the lamp, and went to sleep. In the morning, very early, before the sun had fully come over the red rock formations, Ida saddled Clara and rode into Reedrock and went to the land office and filed a mineral claim on the full 400 acres of her father's ranch. Hector Briggs looked at the assay letter with his reading glasses down on his nose and his eyebrows elevated in an expression that mixed surprise with something else. "This is a serious claim," he said. "Yes," Ida said, "it is. You'll want to verify it with an independent assay before anyone takes it seriously." "I know, but I want it filed today." He filed it. She paid the fee, which took a meaningful portion of what she had left, and she walked out into the morning light with the receipt in her hand and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was not triumph exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like her father standing behind her with his hand on her shoulder, steady and proud. She rode back to the ranch. She had work to do. The first thing she did was write a letter to Amos Whitfield, the assay consultant, whose address was in Denver. She described what she had and what she needed and asked whether he could come or whether he could recommend someone closer. She posted it from the Raydrock General Store that same afternoon. The second thing she did was ride out to the eastern edge of her property and walk the creek bed herself, looking at the rock formations the way her father must have looked at them, trying to see what he had seen. She was not a geologist, but she was an intelligent woman who could read a letter and understand its implications, and what she saw confirmed at least that the rock formations were unusual, that there were veins of color in the exposed stone that she had no business dismissing. The third thing she did that evening was sit on her front step and think about Patrick Langston. This was where things became complicated. Because the truth was that despite everything, despite the hidden motive and the insultingly small offer and the carefully calibrated performance of neighborly concern, she had not disliked him when he was sitting across her table. There had been something in him that was real, in the spaces between the rehearsed lines, a directness in his eyes when he forgot to be careful, a way of holding himself that spoke less of arrogance than of a man who had built something with his own hands and knew what that cost. She was smart enough to know that a man could be genuinely decent and still do something wrong. She was experienced enough to know that wanting something very badly could make a person justify almost anything. She didn't know yet what Patrick Langston was, exactly, but she knew she had not seen all of him. She was also honest enough with herself to acknowledge that he was handsome and that she had noticed it and that this was inconvenient. She put the thought away, where inconvenient thoughts went, and went inside to make supper. He came back 3 days later. He rode up with the same ease and the same courtesy, and this time there was something different in his expression, a slight tension around the eyes that told her he had heard about the mineral claim. "You filed on the whole parcel," he said when she let him in. "I did." He sat down. She offered coffee again and he took it, and they sat across from each other in the same positions as before, but the air between them had changed. "I want to be honest with you," he said. "That would be a welcome change," she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face, something that was not quite shame but was in the neighborhood. "When I came the first time," he said, "I wasn't being fully honest. I knew there were mineral surveys that suggested something significant under your father's land. I had commissioned one myself 18 months ago, before I knew your father was sick. The results were inconclusive but promising. I filed nothing because the results weren't definitive enough and because the land wasn't mine to claim." Ida said nothing. She was watching him. "When your father died," he continued, "I thought about the land reverting. I told myself it was practical to inquire. I told myself I was looking after something that might otherwise go to waste." He stopped. "Those were convenient stories." "Yes," she said, "they were. The truth is that I wanted the land, and I thought if I could get you to sell quickly, before you had time to look into things, you would take the money and leave and I would have what I wanted." The honesty of it silenced her for a moment. She had expected him to defend himself or minimize what he had done. She had not expected him to simply say it. "And now?" she asked. "Now you've filed the claim," he said. "And I think you probably have your father's assay correspondence." "I do." He nodded slowly. "I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong. Your father was a man I respected, and the way I went about this after his death was not something he would have respected." Ida looked at him for a long time, Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the brush with a soft, constant sound. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "You could have let it lie. The claim is filed. There's nothing you can do about it now." "Because it was wrong," he said simply. "And because I think you already knew most of it, and being lied to when you already know the truth is worse than being told it." This was, she had to admit, an unusually perceptive thing to say. "All right," she said. "I accept the apology. I don't know yet whether I trust you, but I accept it." He nodded. He put his hat back on and stood to leave, and then he paused at the door and turned back. "The claim will need to be verified fast," he said. "Meridian Mining has been watching your property. When they hear you've filed minerals, and they will hear today or tomorrow, they'll start looking for ways to contest it." "What kind of ways?" "Any kind. Boundary disputes, prior claim arguments, questions about your father's original deed registration. They have lawyers in Denver and money to spend, and this is exactly the kind of claim they would spend it on." She held his gaze. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because the apology isn't worth much if I only tell you the part that costs me nothing," he said. He left, and Ida stood in the doorway and watched him ride north, back toward his land, and she felt the complicated thing inside her chest shift and rearrange itself into something she didn't yet have a name for. She needed that assay done. She needed it done fast, and she needed it to be unimpeachable. Amos Whitfield's reply came 9 days later, which was faster than she had expected. He was in the field near Leadville but would be passing through Coppervale County within the month, and he would come directly to her, having already done preliminary work on samples from her father. He would bring his full equipment. He asked her to touch nothing on the Eastern Creek bed. 9 days. She had 9 days to wait, and Meridian Mining had heard about her claim within 48 hours, exactly as Patrick had predicted. She knew because Hector Briggs sent word to her, a handwritten note delivered by a boy on a bicycle, saying that a man named Gerald Crane from Meridian's Denver office had arrived in Red Rock and was asking questions. Crane showed up at her ranch the following morning, and he was a different kind of man from Patrick Langston in every way that mattered. He wore a city suit that was already dusty and didn't belong in Red Rock, and he had the smoothed-over manner of a man who spent his professional life acquiring things from people who didn't know enough to refuse. He offered her twice what Patrick had offered. Then he offered her 3 times. He was polite and measured and persistent in a way that made her skin feel like it had ants under it. "Miss Collins," he said, "you are a schoolteacher from Abilene with no background in mining and no capital to develop a claim, even if the assay confirms something significant. The practical reality is that you cannot benefit from this land the way an established company can. Our offer is genuinely generous for an unverified claim." "The claim is filed and valid," she said. "Of course, and we respect that. We're simply saying that before you invest further time and resources in something that may well prove commercially insufficient, you might want to consider the certainty of what we're offering." "Mr. Crane," she said, "I will let you know my decision after my independent assay is complete." "Good day." He didn't like that, but he went. That afternoon, she rode north to Patrick Langston's ranch. She hadn't planned to. She had been riding the fence line on the western edge of her property, checking the condition of the posts her father had put in, and she found herself at the north boundary and kept going, across the open ground between the 2 properties, and was at his gate before she had made a conscious decision about it. His spread was larger than hers by a factor of perhaps 5, a proper working ranch with a substantial main house, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and cattle visible in the distance. The house was built from the same red stone as hers but larger and more settled looking, with a covered porch that ran along the front and a kitchen garden to one side that someone was actually tending. A ranch hand came out and she asked for Patrick, and Patrick came out from behind the barn wiping his hands on a rag and looking surprised to see her. "Gerald Crane paid me a visit," she said. "I heard he was in town. He studied her." "What did you tell him?" "That I would wait for the assay." "But he'll be back and he'll be less polite the second time. He's that kind of man. Patrick nodded. He seemed to be thinking. "Would you like to come in? I can have something made." She hesitated for less than a second. "Yes, thank you." The inside of his house surprised her. She had expected the interior of a bachelor rancher's home to be rough and functional, and it was those things. But there were also books, a real library's worth of them, covering one full wall of the main room, and there was a writing desk with correspondence laid out carefully. And there were 2 or 3 small things that suggested someone had lived here who had an eye for what made a space human, rather than merely habitable. She stood looking at the books while he spoke to someone in the kitchen, and she ran her finger along the spines. History, geography, surveying texts, some fiction, several volumes of poetry. She pulled one out. He came back and saw her with it. Something in his face softened. "My mother's," he said. "She came from Vermont. She brought them in a trunk when my father moved them out here in 1865. She said if the books went, she went." Ida put the volume back carefully. "Where is she now?" she asked. "She died in 1877, he said. "My father the year after. This ranch was their dream." He paused. "It's mine too now, but I can still tell the difference between what I inherited and what I built." "And which part of it is worth more to you?" she asked. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "The part I built," he said. Every time. She believed him. It was inconvenient to believe him, given everything, but she did. They sat at his kitchen table, and his cook, a Mexican woman named Petra who had been with the ranch for years, brought out coffee and fresh bread and sliced salt pork, and they talked for 2 hours. It was the most honest conversation Ida had had in longer than she could remember. The kind of talk that goes somewhere unexpected, that ventures beyond what's polite or cautious, and gets into the real country of who a person is. She told him about Abilene, about the schoolhouse and the 4 years of other people's children, and the way she had loved it but also felt the walls of it, the ceiling of it, the way a life with clear edges could be a comfort and a trap at the same time. He told her about the ranch, about the years after his parents died when he had been 22 years old and responsible for 40 employees, and 1,000 head of cattle, and a mortgage that made him wake up in a cold sweat every month for 2 years. About the drought of 1879 that had killed a third of his herd and forced him to make choices he still thought about. About what it meant to make something work through sheer refusal to let it fail. "The mineral claim on your land," he said at one point, carefully, "changes things. If the assay confirms what I think it will, you'll have something substantial under there. And Meridian will not stop at one polite visit. I know. They have a history in this county. There was a family named Vargas 3 years ago, Ramon Vargas and his wife, who had a claim on the south end of the creek. Meridian pressured them, contested their deed on a technicality that turned out to be fabricated, and it took 2 years of legal fighting before the case was settled. The Vargases won eventually, but it cost them almost everything they had, and Meridian intended that cost. It was a strategy." Ida felt cold. "Ramon Vargas, what happened to them?" "They still have their land, but the fight broke something in Ramon. He sold to a neighbor the year after the settlement, just wanted to be done with it." Patrick looked at her steadily. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because you need to go into this with your eyes open." "And you?" she said. "What is your position in this?" He was quiet for a moment. "I want to help you," he said, "if you'll let me. I have resources you don't have, connections to lawyers who know how to fight this kind of company, and I owe you something for what I tried to do when you first arrived." She looked at him. "That's a convenient position for you to take," she said. "If my claim is validated and I need help and you're the one who helps me, you end up with significant goodwill from the person who owns something very valuable next to your land." He didn't flinch. "That's true. I won't pretend there's nothing in it for me, but I want to be clear about what I'm not offering. I'm not offering to help you in exchange for any portion of the claim. What I'm offering is help because I did you wrong and because what Meridian does to people in this county is something I've watched for 3 years and never done enough to stop." The directness of it landed on her in a way she couldn't dismiss. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. She finished her coffee, said goodbye to Petra, retrieved Clara from the post, and rode home across the open ground with the late afternoon light turning everything golden and long-shadowed, and she thought the whole way. She had been independent her entire adult life, by necessity and by choice. She had learned to rely on herself because the alternatives had usually proven unreliable, and she had built a particular kind of self-sufficiency that was a point of pride, and also, if she was honest, a defensive posture that had prevented some of the pain a less cautious person might have accumulated. She did not give trust easily, but there was something in Patrick Langston that she couldn't dismiss, a quality of honesty that was more costly to him than the easy kind. He had admitted his hidden motive unprompted. He had told her about Meridian's tactics without being asked. He had not offered to help her in a way that sought something in return, when someone with a purely self-interested view of the situation would have absolutely done exactly that. She was beginning to understand that he was a man who had done something wrong, knew it, and was uncomfortable enough with the knowing to actually do something about it. This was rarer than it should have been. Amos Whitfield arrived on a Wednesday morning, 18 days after Ida had filed the claim. He was a compact man in his 60s, with a weathered face and the quietly confident manner of someone who has spent a career being right about things other people doubted. He arrived with 2 mules loaded with equipment, and a young assistant named Webb who said almost nothing and worked very efficiently. He greeted Ida with a formality that warmed into genuine friendliness within an hour, and when she showed him the creek bed and the rock formations and the assay letter he had written to her father, he looked at everything with the thorough attention of a man who takes his reputation seriously. "Your father found the right thing," Whitfield said, running his hand along a rock shelf near the creek. "He just didn't act on it fast enough." "He was waiting," Ida said. "I think he was afraid it wouldn't be confirmed." Whitfield glanced at her. "Or he was afraid it would be," he said quietly. "A man finds something like this. Suddenly the land isn't just a place to live. It becomes a target." The full assay took 4 days. Whitfield and Webb worked methodically along the creek bed and up into the rock shelf, taking samples every 20 feet, logging everything with careful precision. Ida watched when she could and stayed out of the way when she should, and on the evening of the 4th day, Whitfield came to her kitchen table with his notebooks and spread them out and looked at her over his reading glasses. "I'll give you the full written report in 3 days," he said. "But I want you to hear this from me directly first." "Go ahead," she said. "There is a substantial copper and silver deposit running along the eastern portion of this claim," he said. "Not placer, hard rock. The deposit sits approximately 30 feet below the creek bed and extends along the fault line for roughly 300 yards, possibly more. Based on the grade of the samples and the formation depth, we are looking at a commercially significant find. Very significant." He paused. "Miss Collins, I've been assaying claims in the Colorado Territory for 20 years. I've seen 3 finds that I would categorize as genuinely exceptional. What is under your land belongs in that conversation." The room was very quiet. "That's what you told my father," she said. "Yes, and the 3 additional sample points I've taken this week only confirm it. The formation is larger than my preliminary samples suggested." She looked down at the table. Her hands were flat on the wood and she was aware of them, aware of their steadiness, which was a kind of determination she recognized in herself. "How long before Meridian figures out what you found?" "A man like Gerald Crane will know within a week that you had a professional assay done," Whitfield said. "He'll start asking questions. If he's smart, and these company men usually are, he'll assume the results were good or you wouldn't have had it done. He'll move quickly." "Then I need to move faster," she said. She sent a message to Patrick that night by one of the Whitfield's young assistant, a simple note that said, "The assay confirmed it. Come tomorrow morning, I need your help." He came before 8. She told him everything, laying it out plainly, the scope of the find, Whitfield's assessment, Meridian's likely next moves. She watched him absorb it, and she watched him carefully for the thing that would tell her she had made a mistake in trusting him, the flicker of calculation or coveting that would tell her she had misjudged his character. She didn't see it. What she saw was something that looked like relief, and then focus, and then a kind of serious energy that suggested a man who was good at problems stepping toward a problem. "I know a lawyer in Pueblo," he said. "His name is Delaney. He knows mining law better than anyone west of St. Louis, and he's handled 2 cases against Meridian in the last 5 years. He won both. How soon can he get here? I can telegraph today. He could be here by the end of the week." "Do it," she said. "And I need a witness who isn't connected to either of us to verify the assay results. Whitfield is impeccable, but having a second independent voice removes any claim of partiality." "The county has a mining inspector," Patrick said. "A man named Ben Aldis. He's honest. I can bring him." "Good." They worked through it together, point by point, sitting at her kitchen table like 2 people who had been doing this for years, and she noticed that he listened when she spoke and didn't explain things she already knew, and didn't assume that because she was a woman and a schoolteacher she couldn't understand what needed to be done. This was not a small thing. At one point they were both looking at the same map she had spread on the table, and they were leaning in close to see the boundary markings, and she became aware of his proximity, the warmth of him, the smell of horse and clean work, and something underneath that was just him, personal and distinct. She didn't move away. He didn't move away. He looked up and found her already looking at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then they both looked back at the map, and the moment passed but didn't disappear. She thought about it later, when he had gone. She thought about it more than was strictly practical. Delaney arrived on a Friday, and he was everything Patrick had described. A thin Irishman in his 40s with quick gray eyes and the manner of someone who had been underestimated often enough to stop being bothered by it. He read Whitfield's assay report with intense concentration, asked precise questions, and then leaned back and said, "They're going to come after the original deed registration." "What do you mean?" Ida asked. "Meridian's strategy when they want to contest an established claim is to find a technical defect in the chain of title. Something in the original registration, a missing date, an incomplete description, anything they can turn into an argument. They have people in Denver who do nothing else. My father's deed is clean," Ida said. "Briggs confirmed it. Briggs confirmed it to the extent of a county clerk's review. Deeds in the territories often have vulnerabilities that only become visible when someone goes looking." He paused. "I'm not saying there's a problem. I'm saying there might be something they could try to manufacture into one. We should get ahead of it." For the next 3 days, Delaney worked with Briggs to conduct a full title review, tracing every document in the chain back to the original territorial land grant. Ida watched and assisted and learned more about property law in 72 hours than she had in the prior 3 decades of her life. She took notes. She asked questions. Delaney, to his credit, answered them all. Patrick came by each day. Sometimes he brought things, food that Petra had made or supplies from the store in town, and sometimes he just came and helped with the work of the place, the physical labor of keeping a ranch functioning, the water troughs and the fencing and the daily rhythm of maintaining a property. He never made a production of it. He just did it. On the 3rd evening, when Delaney had gone back to the hotel and Whitfield and Webb were encamped out by the barn, Patrick stayed on the porch with Ida as the sun went down behind the rock formations and turned the sky into something that required witnessing. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "I've been thinking about that." "You've been paying your debt," she said. "Delaney Aldis, that's not nothing. It's not enough to simply undo the wrong by fixing the practical damage. The practical damage isn't the whole of it." She looked at him. The sky was doing extraordinary things, purple and orange and a deep rose that felt almost too vivid to be real. "What do you think the rest of it is?" she asked. "I treated you like a problem to be managed," he said. "I came here the first time and I looked at you and I thought, she's alone and she doesn't know this land and she's going to be easy to convince. I underestimated you completely. and I underestimated your father by assuming he hadn't left you everything you needed to protect yourself. My father was smarter than most people gave him credit for, she said. Yes, I know that now. He was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, Ida, not because of the claim, because of who you are and how I looked at you. She heard her name in his mouth, the first time he had used it, and it moved through her like water. Accepted, she said softly, truly accepted. He turned to look at her, and the fading light was on his face, and she could see what was in his expression, something open and uncertain in a man who was not by nature given to uncertainty. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. When this is settled, when the legal work is done and Meridian is dealt with, will you stay? The question landed on her in an unexpected place. Are you asking about the land, she said, or something else? He looked at her for a long moment. Something else, he said. I'm asking about something else. She was quiet, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer needed to be held for a moment before it was said. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'm still learning who I am in this place, who I am when I'm not a schoolteacher in Abilene. I think I might be someone I like more. She paused. And I'm still learning who you are. That seems fair, he said. I will say this, she said. I have not stopped thinking about you since the first morning you sat across that table from me. Even when I was angry, especially when I was angry, probably. He smiled, and it transformed his face, opened it, took the careful guardedness away, and left something young and real. Likewise, he said, Delaney's title review came back clean. The deed was unimpeachable, every link in the chain solid and properly documented, every signature verified, every date accounted for. He spent 2 additional days preparing affidavits from every relevant party, Whitfield, Aldous, Briggs, and Patrick himself, attesting to various aspects of the claim's legitimacy. Gerald Crane made 2 more visits during this period. The first was another attempt to negotiate, with a higher offer that was still laughably below what the claim was worth given Whitfield's assessment. Ida declined it without discussion. The second visit was more thinly veiled in its nature, a series of vague suggestions about boundary complications and the difficulty of developing a claim without substantial capital, which was a form of threat dressed up as advice. After Crane's second visit, Ida went straight to Patrick's ranch, which was becoming a pattern she no longer interrogated. He's trying to scare me, she said. Yes, Patrick said. How are you? The question, asked with genuine simplicity, cut through her armor in a way she hadn't expected. Frightened, she said honestly, and angry, and I want this to be over. He poured her coffee and sat down across from her and said, Tell me what you need. She looked at him. Just this, she said. Exactly this. To sit with someone who is in it with me. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her palm up and held it, and they sat like that for a while, not speaking, in the quiet of his kitchen with Petra moving around somewhere behind them and the sound of the ranch outside. And it was the most settled Ida had felt since the telegram arrived in Abilene. Delaney filed the formal response to Meridian's preliminary legal inquiries in the second week of November, and it was, by all accounts, comprehensive to the point of being devastating. He had prepared for every angle of attack, preempted every technical argument, and included the full weight of Whitfield's assay, Aldis's independent verification, and a chain of title that was cleaner than most properties in the territory. Meridian went quiet for 10 days. Then a letter arrived from their Denver lawyers acknowledging the validity of the mineral claim and proposing a licensing arrangement, by which Meridian would develop and operate the mine on behalf of the claim holder in exchange for a percentage of the yield. Delaney read the letter and laughed, not unkindly. They know they can't win a direct contest, he said. So now they want a partner. What does that mean for Ida? Patrick asked. He was sitting at the table too, because it had become natural for him to be there when important things were being discussed. It means she has leverage she didn't have 3 weeks ago, Delaney said. Whether she takes the licensing offer, brings in a different development partner, or eventually sells outright, she does it from a position of strength. Ida had been thinking about this for days. She knew what her father had wanted, and she knew what she wanted, and those two things had grown over the past weeks to include a third thing she hadn't anticipated when she arrived. "I don't want Meridian," she said. "Not on any terms." "There are other options," Delaney said. "There's a Colorado mining company out of Colorado Springs, Hartwell and Associates, that has a reputation for fair dealing. I know them. They'd be interested. Get me a meeting," she said. The meeting happened in Redrock at the Copper Crown Hotel in the second week of December, by which point the mountains to the north had their first serious snow on them, and the air in the valley had a bite that reminded Ida she was not in Kansas anymore. Hartwell and Associates sent a man named Calloway, who was in his 50s and methodical and refreshingly uninterested in theater. He looked at Whitfield's report, asked careful questions, and made an offer that Delaney reviewed and called solid. She negotiated. She had not known she could negotiate well until she started, and then it turned out she could. She asked for a higher royalty percentage, for guaranteed employment priority for any local labor, for a development timeline that minimized surface disruption to the ranch, and for an annual review clause. Calloway pushed back on two of the terms. They found middle ground on both, and by the end of the afternoon, she had a signed preliminary agreement that Delaney said was among the best independent mineral agreements he had seen a first-time claim holder execute. When Calloway left, Delaney leaned back in his chair and looked at her with genuine appreciation. "Your father taught you nothing about this," he said. "You came to this completely cold. How did you know to ask for the employment clause? I've spent 4 years teaching the children of people who get squeezed out by outside money," she said. "I know what it costs a community when the profit leaves and the workers stay." Delaney nodded. "You should know," he said, "that what you've done here, filing that claim, moving at the speed you moved, building the legal case before Meridian could get organized, is not what most people would have done. Most people, even smart people, would have hesitated or accepted one of the early offers. I had good help," she said. "You had the sense to use it," Delaney said. "That's not the same as having it." Patrick drove her back to the ranch in his buggy, through the cold evening with the stars coming out over the rock formations, and they were quiet for most of the drive in the comfortable way of two people who have moved past the need to fill silence. When they arrived at her gate, he helped her down and they stood in the lamplight from the house, and the night was very clear and very cold and very beautiful. "It's over," she said, and she heard the wonder in her own voice. "This part is over," he said. "The next part is just beginning." She looked up at him. He was looking down at her with that expression she had come to know, the one where the guardedness fell away and she could see straight into him. "Patrick," she said. "Yes. I've decided about whether I'm staying." He was very still. "I'm staying," she said. "I don't want to go back to Abilene. I want to be here on this land in this place. My father had the right instinct. He just ran out of time." "I'm glad," Patrick said, and his voice was quiet and direct. "Genuinely glad. And I've decided something else," she said. "What?" She looked up at him. "That I would like to stop wondering what it would be like to be kissed by you." He was very still for exactly 1 second, and then he stepped toward her and brought his hand up to her face, gentle and deliberate, and kissed her in the cold December air with the stars overhead and the creek running in the dark somewhere east of them. And she kissed him back with the full force of everything she had felt and contained and refused to act on for the past 6 weeks. When they separated, she was breathless, and he looked like a man who had been searching for something, and had unexpectedly found it in the last place he thought to look. "I have been wanting to do that," he said, "since the morning you closed the door on me." She laughed, surprised. "When I threw you out." "When you threw me out," he confirmed. "I walked to my horse thinking that I had completely mishandled everything and also that you were the most remarkable woman I had ever met." She touched his face with her hand, the cold of the air and the warmth of him. "Come in for supper," she said. He came in for supper. And after supper they sat by the fireplace in her father's house, which was becoming her house, and they talked until the fire burned low, and when he finally rose to leave, he took her hand at the door and looked at her with something serious and decided in his face. "I would like to do this again," he said. "Many times." "Yes," she said, "many times." He rode home under the stars, and she stood in her doorway watching until the dark swallowed him, and then she turned back into the warm house and pressed her hand flat against the stone wall of it, feeling the solidity of it, the reality of it. The next months were full. Hartwell and Associates brought in a survey team in January, and the preliminary excavations began in March, and each step confirmed what Whitfield's assay had said, that the deposit was substantial, that it was deep and wide, that it was one of the more significant finds in Coppervale County's history. Work began in earnest in the spring, with local men employed as Ida had negotiated, and the small town of Redrock began to understand that it was about to grow. Ida threw herself into the ranch itself during this period, because the mining operation would sustain and eventually prosper her, but it wasn't what she wanted to live inside of. She wanted the land. She wanted the cattle and the growing things and the daily work of a place that was alive and productive. She brought in a small herd of cattle in April, 15 head to start, and she hired a young man named Jasper who was 19 and from a ranching family in New Mexico, and who took to the work with a seriousness she respected. She expanded the kitchen garden and put in an orchard of apple and pear trees that would not bear fruit for years, but that she planted with the intention of still being there when they did. And this act, more than anything else, was how she understood that she had truly decided to stay. Patrick came every few days, and she went to his ranch nearly as often. They rode together over both their properties in the long evenings, talking about everything, the land and the work and the books on his wall and the children she had taught in Abilene, and the parents he had lost, and what it meant to build a life in a place that still felt, at its edges, like it was being invented. He was funny when he wasn't trying to be impressive, which was often. He was tender in ways he seemed slightly embarrassed by, which made those moments more affecting. He knew this country like a language, could read the weather and the water and the soil the way she could read a page of text, and watching him work was a pleasure she didn't bother to conceal. She told him about the dark past she had been carrying, the years of her father's absence, and the way she had worn his going as a kind of abandonment she had never been able to fully set down. She told him about the man she had nearly married in Abilene, a decent enough person who had wanted her to be smaller than she was, and how she had understood the shape of what he was asking only after she had almost agreed to it. Patrick listened to all of it without fixing it or simplifying it, which was the right way to receive these things. He told her about the years after his parents died, the loneliness of the ranch when the work was done and the evenings were long, the way he had filled that space with more work, because he hadn't yet found anything better to fill it with. He told her about his dark past too, about a business arrangement he had made in 1879 that had benefited him at the direct expense of a smaller rancher, a forced choice driven by the pressure of the drought year that he had justified at the time and regretted since. He told her about it without minimizing it. "You seem to have a pattern," she said, "of doing something wrong and then telling me about it." "It appears so," he said. "I think it's because I find it harder to be dishonest with you than with anyone else I've ever known." This was, she thought, both one of the most honest things anyone had ever said to her and also one of the most romantic, in the particular way that honest things often were. "Is that uncomfortable?" she asked. "Constantly," he said, "and I wouldn't change it." In May, Delaney came back through Redrock on his way to another case in the territory, and he stopped for a meal at the ranch and looked around at the green beginning of the garden, and the small herd in the pasture, and the mine operation visible in the distance along the creek, and shook his head with a satisfaction that was genuine. "I don't say this often," he told Ida, "because it's bad for people's expectations, but I think this is going to work out very well." "I know," she said. In June, on a warm evening when the light was long and golden and the apple trees in the orchard were leafed out and impossibly green, Patrick came to the ranch and was quieter than usual. She noticed it immediately. He helped her with the evening chores and ate supper and talked normally enough, but there was something being held, something that was gathering itself toward speech. After supper they sat on the front step as they often did, watching the dark come down from the east, and the creek was running higher with the snowmelt, and its voice was louder and more present than in the dry months. "Ida," he said. "Yes. I have been thinking about something for a long time, months." She waited. "I have been thinking about the fact that the thing I want most in my life, more than the ranch, more than the land working well or the herd growing or anything I've built, is the continuation of this. What you and I have." He paused. "I want to ask you to marry me." She was quiet for a moment. Not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to be fully present inside the moment, to not rush past it. "You know what I'm like," she said. "I am not a woman who will agree to being smaller to make you comfortable." "I know," he said. "That's most of why I'm asking. I have my own land and my own income, and I will make my own decisions about it. I would expect nothing less. And I want a partnership, not a man who decides and a woman who agrees, an actual partnership." "That's what I'm offering," he said. "I don't want what I had here before you came. I want what we have now, but permanent." She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with an openness that had no guard behind it, all the careful management gone, just a man asking a woman a real question. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Patrick." He exhaled. It was the exhale of a man releasing something he had been holding for a long time, and she heard it in the dark, and it undid her in the best possible way. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet that caught the last of the light, and he put it on her finger, and she looked down at it and back up at him, and he kissed her, and she held on to him, and somewhere behind them the creek sang its constant song. They married in September of 1883 in the Baptist church in Red Rock that had looked newer than everything else when Ida first arrived. The ceremony was small by choice. Delaney came down from Pueblo. Briggs was there. Whitfield made the trip from Denver. Petra cooked an extraordinary meal at Patrick's ranch, which was becoming their ranch, and the whole of Red Rock turned out for the celebration, which went on until midnight. Jasper, who had grown protective of Ida over the months, stood up very straight during the ceremony and looked pleased in the way of someone who had been invested in an outcome and seen it arrive. They danced on the porch under lantern light, and Patrick danced the way you would expect a man who had spent 30 years on a working ranch to dance, which was to say adequately and with absolute commitment. And Ida laughed more than she had laughed in years, and the warmth of the night and the music and the people around them felt like something she had always been moving toward without knowing where it was. That first winter of their marriage was the happiest period Ida had known. They moved between both houses initially, and then settled into what had been Patrick's, the larger house, while Jasper and a new hired hand named Colton took over the management of the Collins property, which they had decided to run as a separate but connected operation. The two ranches working together made both stronger, the combined acreage and resources giving them a stability that neither had alone. The mining operation at Ida's claim was in full production by December, and the first royalty payment arrived and was larger than either of them had expected, and they sat at the kitchen table and looked at it, and Patrick said, "Your father was right," and Ida said, "He usually was," and they were both quiet for a moment with the warmth of the fire and the snow outside and the good weight of a thing that had been earned. In the spring of 1884, Ida realized she was pregnant. She told Patrick on a March morning when the first green was coming back to the valley and the fruit trees in the orchard were budding, and his face went through a sequence of expressions that she catalogued with private delight. Surprise, then something like wonder, then an unguarded joy that softened him completely. He held her face in his hands. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How do you feel?" "Terrified," she said, "and very, very happy." "Me too," he said. "Both of those." The pregnancy was not easy in the summer heat, but she managed it with the same particular stubbornness she brought to everything, staying active, riding Clara at a gentle pace until the doctor in Redrock, a new arrival named Fisher, advised her to stop, keeping up her involvement in the ranch and the mine operations from a more sedentary position than she preferred. Patrick was extraordinary. He was present and attentive without being smothering, which was precisely the balance she needed and hadn't known enough to ask for. He learned what she needed before she asked for it, which was partly his paying close attention and partly a natural sensitivity she had discovered in him early and never gotten tired of finding. The baby arrived in October of 1884, a boy, strong and loud and immediate in his demands. They named him Edmund for her father and called him Edmund from the start, never Eddie, because she wanted the name said fully, out loud, in the world her father had given her. Edmund Patrick Langston was born in the ranch house where his mother had first defied the man who was now his father, in a bedroom lit by lamplight, with the creek running on the eastern edge of the property and the mountains visible from the window when the sun came up. Ida held him and looked at Patrick, who was looking at both of them with an expression she had no language for, something beyond happiness, something that was the specific feeling of a life making sense. "He looks like you," Patrick said. "He looks like my father," Ida said. "And you look like your father," Patrick said, which made her eyes fill with tears she hadn't known were waiting. The years after Edmund's birth were years of building, in every sense. The mine produced steadily and well, providing income that allowed them to expand both operations, buy additional cattle, improve the infrastructure of both properties. Ida stayed active in the mine management, reviewing the annual agreements with Hartwell, negotiating the reviews she had built into the original contract, ensuring that the local employment terms were being honored. The ranch hands employed by the mine were paid fairly and treated decently, and this was not accidental. It was something Ida checked personally and regularly. The town of Redrock grew with the mine. New families arrived, a school was needed, and Ida was the natural choice to help establish it. She didn't teach there herself. She had too much else on her hands, but she was on the school board from its founding, and she hired the teachers and shaped the curriculum and made certain that the children of the mine workers and the ranch hands and the small business owners of Redrock had something worth learning. She and Patrick had 2 more children over the next 4 years. A daughter born in 1886, whom they named Clara, for the gray mare that had carried Ida to Redrock, and who was still alive and still good, grazing in the south pasture like a retired elder. And another son in 1888, born in early spring when the fruit trees were blossoming, whom they called Thomas, for no particular reason except that it suited him from the first moment. Edmund was his mother's child in temperament, curious and direct, and somewhat impatient with things that didn't make sense. Clara was her father's, quiet and observant and funny in unexpected moments. Thomas was something new, a combination they hadn't anticipated, sweet-natured and stubborn in equal measure, with his grandfather's eyes and his father's hands. Patrick's ranch and Ida's claim grew together into something that was no longer 2 separate operations, but one interconnected enterprise. The Langston Collins spread, as the county assessor's office began to list it, a working ranch of 600 acres with a productive hard rock mine operating along the eastern creek bed. There had been an injustice in the story of this land, and Ida knew it and didn't let herself forget it. The Vargas family that Patrick had told her about, the ones who had fought Meridian for 2 years and won and then sold, she tracked them down in 1885. They had moved to Taos. Ramon Vargas, the man whose fight with Meridian had broken something in him, was running a small freighting business there. Ida wrote to him, not out of guilt exactly, but out of a recognition that the same machinery that had tried to take from her had succeeded in taking something from him, and that the least she could do was acknowledge it and see whether there was anything that could be done. Ramon wrote back. He was reserved at first, and then, over several letters, warmer. He was not bitter, which she hadn't expected, But there was a tiredness in his letters that spoke to something that had cost him more than money. She offered him a contract for freighting services, hauling ore concentrate from the mine to the smelter. It was legitimate business, priced fairly, and it gave his operation in Taos a reliable client. He accepted. It became a long professional relationship and eventually a friendship, one that Patrick shared, and the Vargas family visited Redrock twice before the end of the decade, and the injustice was not erased. It couldn't be erased, but it was at least acknowledged and partially mended. Meridian Mining Company, as it turned out, continued its practices elsewhere in the territory. There was a period in 1886 when they attempted to contest a claim belonging to a black homesteader named Samuel Oakes, whose land adjoined a different creek system 3 counties over. Delaney was working that case too, and he reached out to Ida for documentation of Meridian's established pattern of behavior. She provided everything she had, every letter, every record of Crane's visits, everything from the original case. Oakes won. Meridian paid legal costs. Delaney told her the Oakes documentation had been crucial. Gerald Crane, who had sat across her kitchen table twice with his city suit and his smooth manner, left Meridian's employ in 1887. She heard about it from Calloway of Hartwell and Associates, who mentioned it in passing during an annual review meeting. She didn't ask further. It was enough to know. There was an evening in the fall of 1889 when all 3 children were in bed, and the ranch was quiet, and Ida and Patrick were sitting on the covered porch with the last of the season's warmth still in the air. And the sky was doing what it did here, putting on a display of color that never stopped being remarkable, and they were not talking about anything particular, just present together in the way of 2 people who have become the landscape of each other's lives. Patrick had a glass of whiskey. Ida had tea. Clara the mare was visible in the south pasture, standing with the unshakable patience of an old horse who has earned her rest. Edmund's toy horse, forgotten in the yard, lay on its side in the fading light. 7 years, Patrick said, which was not where she had expected the silence to go. 7 years since I filed that claim, she said. 7 years since you closed the door on me. 7 years since I found out you had a bad plan, she said, which was how they talked about it now, with a lightness they had earned. The worst plan, he agreed. He looked at her. The light was doing something remarkable to her face, as it often did, which he had stopped pretending not to notice years ago. I think about that sometimes. What would have happened if you had taken the first offer? I would have gone back to Abilene, she said. You would have had the land. Meridian would have gotten it from you eventually somehow. You would have been a schoolteacher in Kansas. A good one, she said. Yes, he agreed. The best, and desperately wasted. She looked at him. Was I? You were not wasted in Abilene, he said carefully. You did something real there. But this. He gestured, a motion that encompassed the land and the house and the distance, including the mine workings along the creek and the orchard and the sound of the children sleeping inside. This is what you were built for, the scale of it, the fight of it, the building. She thought about this. My father knew, she said. He knew what was under this land, and he didn't tell me about it directly, but he kept the letter. He kept it where I would find it. He trusted you to find what you needed. He trusted me to fight for it, she said. He knew I wouldn't sell. Patrick reached over and took her hand, and she let her fingers close around his, and they sat in the falling dark with the creek running somewhere in the east and the mountains losing their outline to the night sky. Patrick, she said, yes. I want to plant more apple trees in the spring. He laughed, low and warm. How many? A full additional row, along the north fence. Edmund is old enough to help with the planting. I want him to understand what it means to plant something you won't immediately use. That's a fine lesson, Patrick said. And I've been thinking, she said, about what happens to this place eventually, to Edmund, to Clara, to Thomas. The way land passes down in this territory, the assumptions about who manages it. I want it clear in the deed transfer that each of them inherits equally. I'll have Delaney draft it, Patrick said. Clara will probably be the one who runs things, Ida said. She has your instincts and my stubbornness, which is a devastating combination. "She's 5, Patrick said. "I know," Ida said. "I'm planning ahead." He looked at her with the full force of 7 years' knowledge of her, the way you look at someone who has become so familiar that their face carries everything, every morning and every argument and every accomplishment and every ordinary evening on the porch. "I love you," he said. Not dramatically, just as a fact. "I love you," she said the same way. They stayed on the porch until the full dark was settled and the stars were out, brilliant and cold and enormous over the red rock country, and the night sounds of the ranch were all around them, the horses and the wind and the eternal creek. In the house behind them, Edmund dreamed about horses. Clara slept with her fist against her cheek. Thomas made small sounds in his sleep, negotiating with something, even unconscious, the most determined of the three. And somewhere along the eastern creek bed, beneath 30 feet of Colorado rock, the copper and silver deposit continued its patient existence, indifferent to the small dramas that had played out above it, waiting, as it had waited for centuries, to be found by someone who was stubborn enough to look. Ida Collins had been stubborn enough. Her father had known she would be. And in the morning, the same as every morning since she had come to this place, she would rise before dawn and walk the land that was hers, from the front gate to the creek and back, listening to the sound of it, feeling the solid ground beneath her boots, and she would know in the cleanest part of herself that she had not taken the first offer, had not believed the easy story, had not let herself be managed or reduced or driven away from what was true. She had filed the claim. She had stood her ground. She had built a life. And every morning when the sun came over the red rock formations and turned the whole world gold, it was as if the land itself was confirming what she had always suspected, that her father had been right, that this place was worth everything, that she was worth everything. And the man sitting next to her in the dark, who had started out with a bad plan and a hidden motive and had ended up as the most honest person in her life, would reach over without looking up from the stars and find her hand in the dark, and hold it, and she would let him. And that was how they stayed, year after year, in the red rock country of Colorado, while the world changed around them and the children grew and the orchard bore fruit and the mine ran steady and deep. Together and holding. And whole.